She rode into Red Hollow Crossing with $42, a recipe chest her mother left her, and the kind of quiet dignity that made small people feel large and dangerous. By sundown, 6 doors had slammed in her face. By nightfall, she was sitting in the frozen mud outside a boarding house that had a lit lamp, a warm hearth, and a sign that said vacancies. A sign the owner flipped to full the moment he got a good look at her. What happened next would either break Marlo Quinn completely or force an entire town to reckon with itself. If you've ever had a door closed in your face before anyone heard a single word from you, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach set her down at the edge of Red Hollow Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, when the sky had gone the color of old pewter and the wind came cutting down out of the northern range like it had a personal grievance against anything still standing upright. Marlo Quinn climbed down from the coach and stood in the road for a moment, getting her legs back under her after 2 days of rattling travel. She was 31 years old, medium height, brown skin weathered from years of outdoor kitchens and open fires. Her coat was good wool, mended twice at the left elbow. Her boots were solid, if not pretty. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, and with both arms she cradled a wooden chest about the size of a small trunk, reinforced at the corners with iron fittings, its surface worn smooth from handling. The chest smelled faintly of dried herbs and something sweeter underneath. Cardamom, maybe, and the ghost of campfire smoke. She set the chest down carefully in the frozen mud, straightened her back, and looked at the town. Red Hollow Crossing wasn't much to look at. A main street maybe 300 yards long, with a bank, a general store, a feed supplier, a hotel, 3 saloons, a church, and a handful of businesses crowded between them. Beyond the main strip, a scatter of houses climbed a low hillside, smoke coming from most of the chimneys. To the south, the land opened up flat and enormous, ranching country, with the mountains cutting the far horizon into a jagged purple line. It was the kind of town that had been struggling long enough that struggling had started to feel normal. Marlo picked up her chest again and walked toward the hotel. But she'd done this enough times to have a method. Start with the hotel. Not because she expected much, but because the hotel register gave her the name of whoever ran the town's boarding houses, and the boarding house was where she needed to be. Hotels cost too much for a long stay, but they were useful for information. She'd learned that years ago, moving from town to town through Wyoming and Montana and the eastern edge of Idaho, taking cook positions where she could find them, moving on when she'd worn out her welcome or when better work called from somewhere further on. She wasn't a drifter exactly. She had a purpose to all the moving. She was looking for a place that suited her, and she hadn't found it yet. The man behind the hotel desk was somewhere in his 50s, with a face that had been lived in hard. He looked up when she came through the door, then looked back down at his ledger almost immediately, in that way people did when they'd decided something before they'd heard a word. "Help you," he said. Not a question. "I'm looking for a room," Marlo said. "Just a night or 2 while I find longer-term lodging. I can pay in advance." He didn't look up. "Full up." She looked around the lobby. It was empty and quiet enough to hear the wood stove ticking. "I see," she said. "If you're looking for work," he said, still not looking at her. "There's nothing in town right now. Things are slow." "I didn't mention work." "Most people your type come through looking for work." She stood there a moment. She'd learned not to waste her anger on men like this. Anger cost energy, and she needed her energy for things that mattered. "Could you tell me who runs the boarding houses?" she said. He gave her 2 names without looking up. She thanked him and walked back out into the cold. The first boarding house was run by a woman named Clara Hedstrom, who came to the door wiping flour from her hands and took one look at Marlo and said the rooms were all taken. When Marlo asked if she could be put on a waiting list, Clara said she didn't keep a list and closed the door. The second boarding house belonged to a man named August Prill, who was more direct about it. He said he ran a respectable establishment and didn't want any trouble. "I'm not trouble," Marlo said. "I've heard that before," he said, and closed his door too. She stood on the porch of August Prill's boarding house in the gathering dusk and took a slow breath and tried to calculate what she had. $42 and change. Her recipe chest. Her canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes. A knife roll with her best blades. A dog-eared copy of a farming almanac she'd been meaning to return to someone for 3 years. and a letter of reference from her last employer, a cattle operation outside Laramie, where she'd cooked for 14 men for 2 seasons until the owner's son came home from back east and decided he didn't want a cook who argued back. The letter said she was skilled, reliable, and honest. It said she kept a clean kitchen and had never once let the crew go hungry, no matter how bad supply lines got. It was a good letter. She'd been carrying it for 6 weeks. She pulled her coat tighter and started back down the main street to try the general store, on the theory that whoever ran the store would know of any ranches or homesteads looking to hire. What? The general store was run by a round-faced man named Tobias Crick, who was genuinely friendly in the way of a man who liked everybody right up until they wanted something that cost him something. He listened to her ask about work opportunities in the area, nodding along with what seemed like real interest, and then said there wasn't much going on this time of year, winter coming and all, ranches mostly trimming down their payrolls rather than adding. "What kind of work are you after?" he asked. "Cooking, mostly. I've run full ranch kitchens. I can manage supply budgets, preserve for winter, plan meals for large crews. I have a reference letter." He looked at the letter she held out, but didn't take it. "You might try the Chinese Quarter over on Birch Street," he said pleasantly. "They sometimes need help with, well, things like that." Marlowe put the letter back in her coat. "Thank you," she said. She tried 2 saloons. One told her the position had just been filled. The other didn't bother with an excuse. She tried the feed supplier, thinking they might know of ranch operations hiring on. The man there said he'd ask around and to check back in a week. His tone made clear he had no intention of asking around and would prefer she not check back at all. By the time the last light had gone out of the sky, Marlowe had been in Red Hollow Crossing for 4 hours and had nowhere to sleep and no prospect of employment. She stood in the frozen mud of the main street with her chest in her arms and her bag on her shoulder and thought about what she was going to do. The stage didn't run again until Friday. She had money enough to survive until then, but not if she paid hotel rates. And the hotels were full, apparently. She found a small eating house near the edge of the main strip that was still lit, went inside, and ordered coffee and whatever was cheapest on the board. She sat at a corner table and spread out what she knew, the way she always did when things went sideways. Take stock. Think clearly. Don't panic. The woman who brought her coffee was young, maybe 19, with red hands from kitchen work and an expression that suggested she'd been on her feet since before dawn. She set the coffee down and started to turn away. "Excuse me," Marlowe said. The woman looked back. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm trying to find work and a place to stay. I've been turned away from every boarding house in town. Is there anything, any ranch or homestead in the area that might be taking on a cook for the winter?" The young woman looked at her for a moment. Not unfriendly exactly, but cautious in the way of someone who'd learned to be careful about what she said and to whom. "Most of the big ranches already have their winter arrangements made," she said quietly. "The Callaway spread, the Dunmore operation, Pearson's, all set." "What about smaller operations?" The young woman glanced toward the kitchen door, then back at Marlowe. She lowered her voice slightly. "There's Black Spur Ranch," she said, "about 12 miles out southwest, past the river crossing. Gideon Voss's place. He's had trouble keeping kitchen help. The last 2 cooks quit on him before fall. He might still be looking." She paused. "It's a long ride in this weather?" "How far is the river crossing?" 7 miles, maybe 8. Then another 4 or 5 to the ranch." Marlowe looked at her coffee. "Is there a livery stable in town?" "Harker's on the south end. He rents horses." "Thank you," Marlowe said. She meant it. The young woman nodded and went back to the kitchen. Marlowe sat with her coffee and thought about riding 12 miles across frozen prairie in the dark, toward a ranch owned by a man she'd never heard of, on the word of a tired girl in a nearly empty eating house. She finished her coffee, left a fair tip, and went to find Harker's livery, Tom. Harker himself was a naughty, leather-faced man in his 60s who looked her over when she came in from the cold and said nothing for a long moment. "I need to rent a horse," Marlowe said, "and directions to Black Spur Ranch." 12 miles in this weather," Harker said. "I'm aware." He studied her for a moment longer, then something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of practical respect. "That chest heavy?" he asked, nodding at what she was carrying. "Heavy enough. I got a small rig I can rent you. Horse and a 2-wheel cart. Easier than carrying that on horseback." He named a price. "Fair," she said. He took her out to the stable and introduced her to a gray mare named Claudette, who was short and broad and looked at Marlowe with calm, dark eyes. She knows the South Road, Harker said. You'll pass through Crow Creek at about 7 miles. Water's shallow, but ice is forming at the edges, so cross quick and don't stop. Once you're over, look for the fence line running west. Follow it, and you'll see the ranch lights. What's Gideon Voss like? Marlowe asked, checking the harness. Harker thought about that. Difficult, he said. Lost his wife a few years back. He's not much for conversation, runs a hard outfit, but he pays on time and doesn't cheat his men. He paused. He's never fired a woman cook before, if that's what you're asking. Is that because he's never hired one? Correct, Harker said. Marlowe climbed up onto the cart seat, arranged her chest and bag behind her, and picked up the reins. Anything else I should know? She said. If you're not back in 3 days, I'll send someone to look for you, Harker said. There was no particular emotion in it. It was just a practical statement of fact. She appreciated that. She clicked her tongue at Claudette and rolled out into the dark. The South Road was a frozen track between brown fields, and the wind came at her sideways the whole way, pushing at the cart and working through every gap in her coat. The sky had cleared while she was in the eating house, and now it was enormous and black and salted with stars, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't care whether you're alive to see them or not. She thought about the doors. She'd developed a theory about closed doors over the years. There were 2 kinds. The first kind was closed because of something you'd done, a mistake, a wrong word, a piece of bad luck that reflected on your judgment. Those doors you could sometimes push back open if you were willing to apologize and work hard and wait. The second kind was closed before you even knocked, closed because of what you looked like, or where you came from, or something about you that had nothing to do with your actual character or ability. Those doors were different. You couldn't push them open from the outside no matter how much you earned it, because they weren't locked against your actions. They were locked against your existence. Red Hollow Crossing's doors had been the second kind, pretty much across the board. She'd dealt with it before. She'd deal with it again. What she had learned, and learned the hard way, years and miles and more failures than she liked to count, was that the second kind of door sometimes had a back entrance. Not always. Not often. But sometimes, if you found the right situation, the right person, the right moment, you could come in a different way and get to somewhere the front door had been guarding. Black Spur Ranch might be that, might not. But it was what she had. She crossed Crow Creek at a place where the ice had broken back from the banks, and the water ran dark and shallow and fast, Claudette stepping through it without hesitation. And on the far side, Marlowe found the fence line Harker had described and turned west along it, following the wire through the dark. 20 minutes later, she saw lights. Black Spur Ranch came out of the dark slowly, the way things do when you approach them at night. First a glow that could have been anything, then the separate shapes of light through windows, then the outline of buildings, then detail. A long, low main house. A bigger barn set back and to the right. Outbuildings ranged beyond it. A stock pen near the barn, and she could hear cattle moving in the dark. That particular low sound they made when they were settled, but not sleeping. It was a working ranch. Not prosperous, maybe, but not dead either. She pulled Claudette up near the front of the main house and sat for a moment, feeling the cold in her fingers and her face. A light was burning in what looked like a front room. She could see someone moving behind the curtain. She climbed down, tied Claudette to the porch rail, picked up her chest and her bag, and knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing. Then boots on floorboards. The door opened. Gideon Voss was maybe 35, though hard weather made him hard to age precisely. He was tall, carrying his height slightly forward like a man who'd spent years bending through low doorways. Dark hair, a week or more of beard growth. His eyes were a light gray that looked silver in the lamplight, and they were the eyes of a man who'd learned to make assessments quickly, because making them slowly cost too much. He looked at her. She looked back. "I heard you might be looking for a cook," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd worked hard over the years on keeping her voice steady. He said nothing for a moment, just stood in the doorway with the warm light coming from behind him and the cold coming from everywhere else. "Who told you that?" he said. "A girl at the eating house on Main Street in Red Hollow Crossing. You rode 12 miles in the dark on that story? Every door in town was closed, she said. This was the one option I had left. He looked at the chest she was holding, then at her face. It's late, he said. I know. Something moved in his expression. Not softness, but something. Maybe the recognition that standing in the cold arguing about the lateness of the hour was itself a kind of decision. You can put your horse in the barn, he said. There's a bunkhouse. It'll be empty tonight. My hands are all in the main bunk room. I'll talk to you in the morning. He started to close the door. Thank you, she said. He paused, the door half closed. Don't thank me yet, he said. I haven't decided anything. The door closed. Marlowe stood on the porch in the dark with her recipe chest in her arms and thought, all right, that's something. She unhitched Claudette, found the barn, got the mare bedded and watered. The barn was clean and organized in the way of someone who cared about the work. She found an empty stall with clean straw and rolled her coat into a pillow and put her recipe chest under her arm and lay down in the straw and pulled the blanket she always kept in her bag over herself. She was asleep inside 3 minutes. The morning came in gray and cold, and the sound of it was boots on frozen ground and the low talk of men moving between the barn and the bunkhouse before first light. Marlowe heard them and lay still for a moment, orienting herself, then got up, checked her face and hair in the small metal mirror she carried, put herself in order, and went to find the kitchen. The ranch kitchen was attached to the main house by a covered walkway, a practical arrangement for bad weather. It was a decent-sized room with a cast-iron range that was well-built but currently cold and unlit, a long work table, open shelves stocked with reasonable provisions, a dry sink, and a water pump that worked. Someone had started doing dishes and stopped halfway through. There was a heel of yesterday's bread sitting uncovered on the table and a pot with what appeared to be the remains of last night's beans in it. Marlowe looked at all of it for about 30 seconds. Then she started a fire in the range. By the time Gideon Voss appeared in the kitchen doorway 40 minutes later, she had the range going strong, a fresh pot of coffee on, oatmeal with dried apple and a bit of brown sugar working in a heavy pot, and she had found a collection of eggs in a covered basket near the cold wall, and was scrambling them in a cast-iron pan with some dried herbs and a small piece of salt pork cut fine. He stood in the doorway looking at all of this. I didn't tell you to start cooking, he said. You didn't tell me not to, she said without turning around. The eggs were going to turn if they sat much longer. Sit down if you want coffee. Silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping back. She poured his coffee without looking at him and went back to the eggs. I'm Marlowe Quinn, she said. I've cooked for ranch crews from Laramie to Missoula. I've never had a man go hungry when I was running a kitchen, and I've never run over budget. I can manage provisions, work with what I have when supply runs fall through, and I don't complain unless complaining will fix something. She slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of him. That's what I can offer. I'd like to work here. He looked at the eggs. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. 1 week trial, he said. I'm not making promises beyond that. Fair enough, she said. I have 9 men on the crew right now. They've been eating badly since October. If you're half as good as you seem to think you are, that's going to change. It'll change, she said. He cut into the eggs, ate a bite. His expression didn't do much, but something in the set of his jaw shifted slightly, and he picked up his fork again. The crew eats at 6, 12, and 6, he said. There's an order ledger in the second drawer for supply requests. Stage comes through on Fridays if you need to send to town. I'll need to take inventory this morning, she said. Go ahead. He stood up, taking his coffee cup with him. And Quinn, she looked at him. The last cook left because the men gave her a hard time. I won't have that, but I won't be able to stop it if you give them a reason. It was, in its way, both a warning and a kind of implicit offer of protection. She wasn't sure which he intended or whether he'd thought about it carefully enough to intend either. I've handled hard men before, she said. I expect you have, he said, and walked out. The crew came in for breakfast at 6, 9 men ranging from a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 to a weathered veteran somewhere past 60 who moved with a slight list to his left side, like an old ship compensating for permanent weather. They came in loud and rough-mannered, the way cold, hungry men always are before food, and they stopped when they saw Marlowe at the range. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the oldest of them, the one with the list, pulled off his hat and said, "Morning, ma'am." in a tone that suggested he'd been raised to do that and hadn't entirely forgotten it. His name, she learned over breakfast, was Bram Mercer. 63 years old, he said, when she asked, though he looked older. Worked Black Spur since before Gideon's father died. The other men, Teddy, Cal, the Ruiz brothers Miguel and Ernesto, a gap-toothed Canadian named Fourier, a quiet man named Dell, a boy called Patches for reasons no one explained, and a sharp-eyed hand named Knox, settled around the long table and waited. She set food in front of them: eggs, oatmeal, bread she'd found and toasted over the range, coffee hot enough to count for something. Nobody spoke for the first few minutes. Then Teddy, who was maybe 25 and had the look of someone who said whatever crossed his mind, said, "Who are you?" "New cook," she said. "My name's Marlowe Quinn." "Since when?" "Since this morning," she said. "Voss hire a woman cook?" Teddy said, addressing this more to the table than to her. "Apparently," she said, and refilled his coffee. He looked at his cup. He looked at the food. He ate. Mom. By the end of that first week, 3 things had become clear. The first was that Marlowe Quinn could cook, not just competently, but in the way that changed the feeling of a day. The men who'd been dragging themselves to meals because they had to now came early. The portions were right. The flavors were real. She knew how to use salt and how not to. She knew that men doing physical labor in cold weather needed fat and warmth and something sweet at the end of a long day, and she provided all 3 without being asked. The second thing was that the ranch's provisions had been badly mismanaged. She found spoilage in the root cellar that should have been caught weeks ago, supplies ordered in wrong quantities, staples nearly out that should have been reordered in September. She made a list, organized it by priority, and set it in front of Gideon at the kitchen table on day 4. He looked at it. He looked at her. "How much to fix this?" he said. She had the number ready. He didn't argue. The third thing that became clear was that Horace Blackwell was going to be a problem. She didn't know who he was until day 6, when Gideon came in from town with a harder expression than usual and told her there'd been talk. "What kind of talk?" she said. "The kind that comes from Blackwell," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she poured without comment. "He runs the bank in Red Hollow Crossing. He's got opinions about how things ought to be done in this county, and one of those opinions is that certain people don't belong in certain positions." "Certain people," she said. "I'm telling you straight because you should know." "I appreciate that." She sat down across from him. "Has he said anything to you directly?" "Not yet," Gideon said. "He will." She thought about that. "Does his opinion affect the ranch?" she said. "He holds paper on 3 operations in this valley. Not mine, but he's got influence." "Is he the kind of man who acts on his opinions?" Gideon looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Then I'll do my job well enough that acting on them costs him more than it gains him," she said. Something moved in Gideon's expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. "That's an approach," he said. "It's the only one I've got," she said. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind was picking up again, and the temperature was dropping, and the cattle in the pen were moving against it, and somewhere in the North Range a coyote was making its particular claim on the dark. Marlowe Quinn sat in the warm kitchen of Black Spur Ranch and thought about everything she'd carried 12 miles through the cold to get to this table, and she thought about the doors that had been closed in her face, and she thought about Horace Blackwell and what it meant that powerful men in places like this made it their business to keep certain people from finding a place to stand. She refilled her own coffee. She was not, she decided, going anywhere. But the morning the trial week ended, Gideon found her in the kitchen running through the newly organized inventory, making notes in her precise handwriting on the order ledger. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You know what day it is?" he said. "I do," she said, without looking up. "The trial period's over." "Yes." Pause. "Kitchen's yours," he said. "Permanent, if you want it." She looked up. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away at something on the shelf that didn't particularly need looking at. "I want it," she said. "Right," he said, and pushed off from the doorframe. "Supplies come Friday. The order's already sent." He was halfway down the covered walkway when she called after him. "Mr. Voss?" He stopped. Thank you, she said. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Don't thank me, he said, for the second time since she'd arrived. You earned it. He went out into the cold morning, and Marlowe Quinn turned back to her ledger, and somewhere outside a calf was calling for its mother, and the range fire was burning clean and steady, and the day had begun. The thing about feeding people well is that it changes them in ways they don't notice until it's already happened. By the third week of November, the men of Black Spur Ranch were different in small but measurable ways. They came to meals on time instead of dragging in late. They washed their hands without being asked. They argued less at the table and got to work faster in the mornings. None of them would have said it was because of the food. Men like that didn't talk about food that way. But it was. Marlowe understood this the way she understood most things about cooking, which was that the purpose of a meal was never just the calories. It was the 15 minutes when a man could sit still and feel like the world was organized in his favor, even if only for as long as it took to empty a plate. She had started keeping a small notebook in her apron pocket. Not a recipe book. She had her mother's chest for that, and she knew most of those by heart anyway. This was an observation book. She wrote down what each man ate more of and what he left, what time they came in hungry versus what time they came in just eating out of habit, what the weather did to appetite, what hard work did to it. It was the kind of information that made a kitchen run better, and she'd been keeping notebooks like it since she was 19 years old, learning beside her mother in a kitchen in eastern Kansas. Bram Mercer was the one who noticed the notebook first. He was at the kitchen table one afternoon while she was putting together a stew for supper, and he watched her make a note without saying anything for a while, and then he said, "What do you write in that thing?" "Information," she said. "About what?" "About what people need." He thought about that. How do you know what people need just from watching them eat? You can learn almost anything about a person from watching them eat, she said. She added a handful of dried herbs to the pot. You eat fast when you're anxious about something. You eat slow when you're tired in your body but your mind won't settle. You leave meat when something's bothering your teeth. You eat more bread when you didn't sleep. She looked at him briefly. You've been favoring your left hand for 2 weeks. I put the cups on the left side of the table now, so you don't have to reach. Bram looked at his left hand, then at where the cups were sitting. Well, he said. He seemed genuinely unsettled in a not unpleasant way. I didn't notice that. You weren't supposed to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's a strange kind of gift. It's not a gift, she said. It's just paying attention. She'd learned that from her mother, too. That attention was the thing most people thought they were giving when they were actually withholding it. Real attention cost something. It required you to make space in your thinking for someone else's reality. Most people couldn't do it for long or didn't bother. Her mother had done it constantly, which was why people who sat at her mother's table felt, without quite knowing why, that they'd been seen. Marlowe was trying to do the same. It was harder out here, where the men were rough and quiet and not accustomed to being paid attention to in any particular way. But she was learning them, one meal at a time. The supply situation improved by the end of November, partly because the order she'd put through on her first week was a good one, and partly because she started trading with a Shoshone woman named Ada, who came by the ranch every 10 days or so with dried goods and preserved foods that didn't show up in the general store ledger. Ada was compact and unhurried and said very little, and she and Marlowe had reached an understanding within about 3 visits that worked for both of them. Ada brought things Marlowe could use: dried service berries, preserved game, the kind of dried root she showed Marlowe how to cook that the men ate without knowing what it was and asked for more of. Gideon saw Ada's cart coming one morning and came to find Marlowe in the kitchen. You know her? He said. We've done a few trades. She doesn't trade with everyone. I know, Marlowe said. He considered this for a moment. Where's the budget coming from? I renegotiated the salt pork contract with Crick's store, Marlowe said. I found a better price at the feed supply for dried corn. He stocks it for livestock, but it's the same product. The difference covers Ada's goods and then some. Gideon looked at her. You renegotiated with Tobias Crick? He said. He's overcharging you by about 20% on preserved goods. I told him I'd take the ranch's dry goods order elsewhere if he didn't come down. He came down. Gideon leaned against the doorframe and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man recalibrating something internal. I've been paying that markup for 4 years, he said. I know, I found the old ledgers. She didn't say it unkindly, she just said it. You went through the old ledgers. I wanted to understand the kitchen's history. I wasn't looking for problems, I just found them. He pushed off the door frame and went back outside without saying anything else. But at supper that night, when she set down a dish she'd been experimenting with, a slow-braised short rib with dried serviceberry and root vegetables, something that had taken all afternoon, he ate 2 servings and didn't say a word, which was, she was learning, Gideon Voss's version of high praise. The first direct move from Horace Blackwell came in early December, and it came through a man named Sutter who worked at the bank and was known to carry Blackwell's messages when Blackwell didn't want to be seen carrying them himself. Sutter came to the ranch on a Thursday, when Gideon was out on the North Range, and Marlowe was in the kitchen with the door to the covered walkway propped open to manage the heat from the range. She heard him talking to Knox in the yard, and she heard her own name, and she kept working but listened. Blackwell's asking whether Voss is aware of the woman's background, Sutter was saying. Knox said something she couldn't quite catch, just that she's been through 3 counties and hasn't held a position more than a season, Sutter said. That kind of instability raises questions. Marlowe put down her knife. She walked to the door of the covered walkway and looked out into the yard. Sutter was a narrow man in a good coat, and he had the look of someone who'd spent enough time delivering bad news on behalf of someone else that he'd started to confuse the delivering with the power. "Mr. Sutter," she said. He looked at her. Knox looked at her, too, with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between warning and apology. "I heard my name," she said pleasantly. "I thought I'd come introduce myself since we haven't met." Sutter's expression went through several quick adjustments. "Miss Quinn, is it?" "It is." She stayed in the doorway, not coming out, not retreating. "I was just speaking with the ranch hand here about staffing matters." "I gathered," she said. "I've worked in 3 counties over 8 years. That's not instability. That's a working history. Any rancher in Laramie County or Sweetwater County can verify my time and performance." She paused. "If Mr. Blackwell has specific questions about my qualifications, he's welcome to ask them directly. I'm not hard to find." Sutter looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who'd expected a different kind of reaction. Flinching, maybe, or defensiveness, and wasn't sure what to do with what he'd gotten instead. "I'll pass that along," he said, and went back to his horse. Knox waited until Sutter was well down the drive before he turned back to Marlowe. "He's going to make trouble," Knox said. He wasn't particularly warm, Knox. He was a man who kept himself tight and didn't give much out, but the warning was genuine. "I know," she said. "You don't seem worried." "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not going to show him that." She went back inside and picked up her knife again. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she'd learned about fear over the years. You couldn't make it go away, but you could refuse to let it run you. You could feel it fully and still decide to put it somewhere it wouldn't be in the way. December went hard and cold and busy. The ranch had a rhythm in winter that was different from the other seasons. The work didn't stop, but it changed shape. There was still fence to check, cattle to move, equipment to maintain, but the days got short and the cold demanded more from everyone. Men came in from the range with their faces raw and their hands barely working, and Marlowe made sure there was always something hot waiting, always coffee, always enough. She started a bread rotation. Different bread every other day, so there was always something fresh. It sounds small. It wasn't small. Teddy told her about 6 weeks into her time there that she'd ruined him for regular food. "I go into town now, and the food tastes like cardboard," he said. This was at the supper table with most of the crew around, and a few of the men laughed. "That's Crick's doing, not mine," she said. "I'm serious," Teddy said. He was looking at her with that particular expression of a young man who's been surprised by something and hasn't quite decided how to file it. "How do you make it taste like that?" "Like what?" He waved his fork vaguely. "Like it was made by someone who gave a damn." A few of the men got quiet in the way they did when Teddy accidentally said something true out loud. Marlowe said, "That's because I did," and picked up her own plate and went back to the kitchen. She heard them talking after she left. Not what they said, just the tone of it. It was different from the first week. The suspicion wasn't gone exactly, but it had changed into something else, something more like puzzlement, which was better. Suspicious men kept their distance. Puzzled men got curious, and curious men paid attention. And paying attention was how you started to actually see someone. The friction from Blackwell didn't stop at Sutter's visit. By mid-December, Marlowe heard from Ada, who heard things from several directions, that Blackwell had been speaking at the Cattlemen's Association about the problem of outside elements disrupting the established order of the county's workforce. He didn't use names. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he meant. She went to Gideon with it on a Wednesday evening, after supper, when the ranch was quiet. He was in the front room of the main house, going through account books. He looked up when she came in. "You know about Blackwell's talk at the association?" she said. It wasn't a question. He leaned back in his chair. "I heard." "Does it affect your position here, with other ranchers?" "Blackwell thinks it should," Gideon said. "He's been working the room, so to speak." He set his pen down. "I got a letter last week from Dunmore suggesting I might want to reconsider my staffing arrangements before the spring cattle sale. Dunmore's not brave enough to do anything on his own, but he's Blackwell's instrument when Blackwell wants one." Marlowe looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. "Do you want me to go?" she said. The question sat between them. "No," Gideon said. He said it simply, without looking away from her. "I run this ranch according to what works for this ranch. That's always been my position, and it isn't changing because Horace Blackwell has opinions." She nodded. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I've dealt with men like him before, in other counties. They don't stop on their own. If there's going to be real trouble, financial pressure, problems at the sale, anything that hurts the ranch, I need to know. I'm not going to let my presence here cost you." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "That's decent of you," he said, "but I'm not in the habit of making decisions out of fear of what Horace Blackwell might do." He picked his pen back up. "You do your job. Let me worry about Blackwell." She would have found it patronizing, coming from a different kind of man. From Gideon, she understood it for what it was. Not dismissal, but a genuine division of labor. He was asking her to trust that he'd hold his end. She wasn't sure she entirely trusted it, but she wasn't sure she didn't either. It was Knox who told her quietly, on a Friday morning in the third week of December, that Bram Mercer had been looking poorly for several days and hadn't said anything to anyone about it. Marlowe had noticed it herself. The old man moving slower, eating less, a grayness under the weather-beaten color of his skin that hadn't been there before. But Bram was the kind of man who treated his own discomfort as a private matter, and she'd been waiting for an opening. She found it that Friday afternoon. She brought his coffee to the barn, where he was mending a piece of harness, and she sat down on a hay bale near him without being invited and handed him the cup. He took it. He looked at her. "You're going to ask me how I'm feeling," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not," she said. "You've dropped weight in 2 weeks. Your color's wrong. You're slower on the stairs than you were last month." He was quiet for a moment. "That's just winter," he said. "Slows a man down." "Bram!" He turned the coffee cup in his big hands, looking at it. "My chest hurts some," he said, finally. "Been tight since last Tuesday." "In the middle?" she said. "Or to the left?" He pointed vaguely to his left side. Marlowe looked at him steadily. "Is it worse when you exert yourself?" "Some." "Does it go into your arm?" A pause. "Sometimes." She kept her voice very level. "Bram, you need a doctor. Nearest doctor's 20 miles. "I know how far the doctor is," she said. "It's probably nothing. Old muscles, maybe. I've had worse." She leaned forward slightly. "I had an uncle who said the same thing and was dead in a week," she said. "It wasn't kind, exactly. It was the kind of thing you say when kindness isn't the point. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I'm not being overcautious." Bram looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality of a man who'd spent a lifetime making quiet, practical assessments of hard situations, and what she saw working in his face was exactly that. The calculation of risk, the slow admission that someone else might be seeing something he'd been refusing to see. "You'd have to tell Voss," he said. "Yes." He looked back at his harness. "He's going to fuss," Bram said. "Probably," she said. "I'll try to limit it." Something that might have been almost a smile crossed his face briefly. All right, he said. She went to Gideon that evening with what she knew. She told him plainly the symptoms, the duration, what she thought it meant. She didn't use alarming language, but she didn't soften it either. Gideon stood in the kitchen and listened. His face didn't do much, but his hands, resting on the back of a chair, tightened slightly. How serious? He said. I don't know, she said honestly. Serious enough that waiting is a bad idea. He needs to be seen. Tonight? I'd say tomorrow morning, earliest. Tonight if he gets worse. Doc Emery is in Carver's Mill, Gideon said. Carver's Mill was 22 miles east, on better roads than the south run into Red Hollow. I can send someone first thing. It should be someone who can handle a team fast, she said. And Bram should go himself if he can travel. A description through a messenger takes too long and loses too much. Gideon straightened up. He was thinking through logistics the way he thought through most things, efficiently, without wasted motion. Knox can drive, he said. He's the best hand with a team in bad conditions. She nodded. I'll put together what I can tonight to keep Bram stable and comfortable. If his condition changes before morning, come get me, Gideon said. No hesitation. Any hour. She met his eyes briefly. All right, she said. She spent that evening in a state of focused quiet, doing what she could with what she had. She knew some things about what happened to the heart. Her mother had known more, had learned from a healer she'd known in Kansas who'd had knowledge of the body that most people around her had either ignored or dismissed. Marlo had paid attention. She'd always paid attention. She made a tonic from things in her chest that she knew supported the heart's steadiness. Not medicine, exactly, not in the way a doctor would call it, but things that helped and didn't harm. She sat with Bram for an hour that evening, making sure he ate something light, making sure he was warm and not exerting himself, watching his color and his breathing. You don't have to sit with me, Bram said. I know, she said. I'm not going to die tonight. I know that too, she said. I just like the company. He looked at her sidelong. You're a strange woman, Marlo Quinn. People have said so, she agreed. He was quiet for a while. I've been at this ranch a long time, he said eventually. Longer than Gideon's been alive. I knew his father, I knew his mother before she died. I've seen a lot of people come and go. He paused. You're the first cook who ever brought me coffee in the barn. That seems like an oversight on everyone else's part, she said. He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. She walked back to the main house through the cold dark, and the stars were out again over the mountains, and the cattle were quiet in the pens. And she stood for a moment on the porch of the covered walkway, and breathed the cold air and thought about what the next day would bring. There were things in this life you could prepare for and things you couldn't. Bram Mercer had 63 years of hard living in him, and his body was trying to tell him something it had been patient about for too long. Whether that patience had been enough? That was in the hands of distance and weather and Dr. Emery's ability to get to him fast enough. She went inside and checked the kitchen fire and went to bed. She did not sleep well. By 5 the next morning, she was already up, and Knox was in the yard hitching the team, and Bram was moving slowly but moving, which was itself something to be grateful for. Gideon was up too. He'd come out of the house before she expected him, already dressed and quiet, standing near the team and checking the harness with his own hands. He and Bram said very little to each other. Men who've known each other long enough sometimes communicate most clearly in silence. Marlo handed Bram a wrapped bundle for the road. Biscuits, dried meat, a small jar of the tonic, a wool blanket she'd taken from the spare room. Bram looked at the bundle. You think of everything, he said. I try, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was more than thanks, something that didn't have a simple word for it, maybe recognition. The kind of look one person gives another when they've realized, maybe a little late, that this person was going to matter. Knox climbed up to the box, and Bram settled himself in the bed of the wagon, wrapped in the blanket, and Gideon put his hand briefly on the side of the wagon and said something to Bram that Marlo didn't hear. Then Knox slapped the reins and the team went down the drive, and Marlo stood in the cold watching the wagon until the dark took it. Gideon came to stand beside her. They stood there for a moment together. He'll be all right, Gideon said. He didn't say it like a man who was certain. He said it like a man who needed to say it out loud to give it a better chance of being true. Yes, Marlo said. She went inside and started breakfast for the remaining crew, and the ranch morning opened up around her the way mornings did. Slowly, cold, with everything still unresolved and the day insisting on beginning regardless. Knox came back without Bram. That was the first thing Marlowe saw when the wagon rolled back into the yard late that same afternoon. One man on the box instead of two, and the bed of the wagon empty except for the folded blanket she'd sent with Bram that morning. Her stomach dropped before her mind caught up with what it meant. Knox climbed down, and she was already at the yard fence. Doc Emery wasn't in Carver's mill, Knox said. His face was tight from cold and something else. His wife said he went out to the Hargrove homestead 2 days ago and hadn't come back. Fever situation, she thought. Where's Bram? Marlowe said. Hargrove homestead is 11 miles north of Carver's mill, Knox said. I left Bram at the mill. He's at the boarding house there. Woman named Mrs. Pell is keeping an eye on him. He was worse by the time we got there. I didn't want to take him 11 more miles on bad roads without knowing if Emery was even still at Hargrove. He paused. I came back for orders. She didn't wait for Gideon. He was somewhere on the south fence with Teddy, and by the time someone went out to find him and he rode back in, another hour would be gone. Harness the other team, she said. Knox looked at her. Gideon's not back, he said. I know, she said. Harness the other team and give me 20 minutes. She went to the kitchen and moved fast, pulling things from her chest, the tonic she'd made the night before. There was still some left, a second jar she'd prepared that morning on instinct, dried willow bark, a poultice compound she'd learned for inflammation, her good knife roll, clean cloth strips she kept for cooking burns that worked just as well for field dressing. She packed it into a canvas satchel. She changed into her heaviest coat and her second pair of wool socks. She took the kitchen lantern down and checked the oil level and hung it by the door. She was back in the yard in 17 minutes. Knox had the second team harnessed. He was holding the reins and looking at her with an expression that had moved past doubt into something more like unwilling respect. You know the road to Hargrove? She said. I know the first stretch, he said. Past that, it gets complicated. Can you navigate it in the dark? If the stars stay out, he said. She climbed up onto the box beside him. Then let's go before we lose them. She left a note on his kitchen table for Gideon. 4 lines. Bram's situation changed. Gone to Carver's mill and then north to find Emery. Back as soon as possible. Knox slapped the reins and they went. Hushed. The road to Carver's mill was better than the south road into Red Hollow Crossing, but not by a great deal. It ran along the eastern edge of the valley before cutting through a low pass, and in December the pass collected wind like a funnel, and the cold there was a different animal than the cold in the open range. It had a weight to it, a pressured quality, like it was trying to get inside your coat through sheer persistence. Neither Marlowe nor Knox were much for talking, which turned out to suit the road. Knox drove with the focus of a man who understood that the horses needed his full attention on the ice-edged tracks, and Marlowe sat beside him with her hands in her lap and thought about Bram. She thought about the symptoms she'd catalogued, the chest tightness, the left arm, the shortness of breath on exertion, the color. She thought about the pace of it, how it had progressed over 2 weeks from something easy to dismiss to something that couldn't be dismissed anymore. She thought about Dr. Emery, whom she'd never met, and whether he was the kind of doctor who would know what to do, and whether the kind of doctor who knew what to do could do enough. She thought about her mother. Her mother had known a woman in Kansas who'd outlived 3 husbands and raised 6 children, and at the age of 74 had said, with genuine conviction, that the human body was tougher than anyone gave it credit for. That most of what killed people wasn't the illness, but the decision to stop fighting it. Her mother had half agreed, half argued with that all her life. Marlowe had watched her work on people who should have been past helping and sometimes pull them back from it by sheer insistence that they were not done yet. She didn't know if Bram had decided anything yet. She hoped he hadn't. Knox said, without looking at her, "You do this kind of thing often? Drive into the dark after doctors?" "Make decisions that aren't yours to make," he said. No edge in it. It was a genuine question. She thought about how to answer that. "I make decisions when I can see what needs doing and no one else is making them," she said. "If Gideon were there, it would be his call. He wasn't there." "He won't be angry," Knox said. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Blackwell's going to hear about this." Blackwell hears about everything, she said. That's how men like him stay powerful. They build information networks and then they use them to make the people they don't like feel watched. She paused. I've been watched before. It doesn't slow me down. Knox said nothing for a moment. Then, when Voss said he was taking on a woman cook, I thought, I won't say what I thought. I have a good imagination, Marlowe said. Yeah, he said. Well, it was wrong. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite a compliment either. It was a man who'd changed his assessment and was saying so plainly, without making it into more than it was. She appreciated that kind of honesty more than she would have appreciated flattery. Thank you, she said. They rode on. Mrs. Pell's boarding house in Carver's Mill was a narrow two-story building on the main street, with a lamp in every window as if the proprietor believed strongly in being visible. Mrs. Pell herself answered the door before Knox knocked twice. A broad woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and quick hands who had already put Bram in the best room and propped him on enough pillows to keep him half sitting, which Marlowe immediately recognized as the right instinct. He's been stable for 2 hours, Mrs. Pell said, leading Marlowe up the stairs. But stable isn't the same as good. His color's still wrong. Has he slept? Dozes, wakes up, complains about the pillows. That's a good sign, Marlowe said. Bram was awake when she came in, which was the second good sign. He looked at her standing in the doorway and said, I figured you'd come. Did you think I'd just leave you in someone else's care? She said, coming over and setting her satchel on the nightstand. I hoped you'd let Knox handle it, he said. It's a long drive. 40 miles round trip isn't long, she said. In December it is, he said. Stop talking and let me look at you. He stopped talking. She checked him. Color, breathing, the pulse at his wrist, the quality of the sweat on his forehead, the way he breathed when she pressed carefully at the left side of his chest. He winced at that, a controlled wince, the kind that came from a man who'd trained himself not to show pain. Same place? She said. Same place, he said. She sat back and thought for a moment. You need Emery, she said. What I have in this bag is maintenance, not treatment. I can keep you comfortable and stable through the night, but what's happening in your chest needs a doctor who can listen to it properly and tell you what to do next. I know that, he said. Knox and I are going out to Hargrove. He looked at her. It's 9 o'clock at night. I'm aware. The Hargrove Road cuts through Saddle Creek, he said. There's always ice in the creek bed in December. Knox knows that road? He knows the first stretch, she said. He'll know to go slow at the creek, Bram said, and she recognized it for what it was. Not an argument, but the habit of a careful man passing on what he knew. I'll make sure of it, she said. She gave him the tonic, measured out carefully, and the willow bark preparation in warm water that Mrs. Pell heated for her on the stove downstairs. She made sure his blankets were right. She left a clean cloth and a small jar of the preparation on the nightstand with instructions for Mrs. Pell, written out in a precise hand for if his condition changed before she got back. At the door, Bram said her name. She looked back. He was an old man propped up on someone else's pillows in a borrowed room, and he knew it. And he looked it, and something in his face was doing the quiet accounting that people did when they weren't sure of the numbers anymore. If it comes to it, he said, I've had a good run. It's not coming to it, she said. Go to sleep. She closed the door before he could say anything else and went back down the stairs. The road to Hargrove Homestead ran north out of Carver's Mill, along a creek drainage that had no good name on any map Marlowe had ever seen, through stands of bare cottonwood and across 3 low crossings where the water was shallow but the ice had built up on the banks in thick white shelves. Knox took those crossings at a walk, the way Bram had said to, and the horses went through them steady and calm. Past the 3rd crossing, the road climbed onto a bench of high ground, and the stars were clear from up there, enormous. The Milky Way laid out like scattered flour across a dark table. Any other night she would have taken a moment for it. Not tonight. How much further? She said. Should be another 2 miles, maybe, Knox said. He was reading the terrain the way experienced hands did, by feel as much as sight, watching for landmarks in the dark. There's a gate with a cattle skull on the post, Hargrove's marker. Once we see that, it's a 1/4 mile to the house. She saw the gate 20 minutes later. The skull gleamed dully in the lantern light, eyeless and indifferent. The Hargrove house was dark except for one window at the back, a thin line of light under a door. Knox pulled the team up, and she was climbing down before they fully stopped. She knocked hard. A voice inside, a man's, cautious. "Who's there?" "My name's Marlo Quinn. I'm a cook at Black Spur Ranch, 12 miles south of Red Hollow Crossing. I was told Dr. Emery might be here. I have a medical situation." A long pause, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened on a lean man in his 60s who was clearly Dr. Emery. He had the look of a doctor, which was the look of someone who'd learned to be tired without letting it show all the way. Behind him, she could see a young woman asleep on a cot near the fireplace, her face still flushed, but her breathing even. The fever situation, apparently resolving. "You drove up here from Carver's Mill?" Emery said. "At this hour?" "From Black Spur," she said. "I left one of our hands in Carver's Mill, Mrs. Pell's boarding house. He's been having chest symptoms for 2 weeks that are getting worse. Left side pain radiating to the arm, shortness of breath on exertion, pallor, fatigue. I've been keeping him stable, but he needs proper examination." Emery looked at her steadily. "How long have the symptoms been progressing?" 2 weeks, but he hid the worst of it. The acute episode started yesterday." "You're his cook?" "Yes." "And you recognized all of this?" "My mother was a healer," she said. "I paid attention." He looked at her a moment longer, in the way of a man who is deciding whether to be impressed or simply to move forward. He chose to move forward. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. He glanced past her at Knox and the team. "Can your horses make it back to Carver's Mill?" "They can," Knox said. "Then give me 10 minutes, Emery said again, and went back inside. He was ready in 8. He was a practical man, Dr. Emery, which Marlo respected. He climbed onto the wagon beside Knox without complaint, carrying a black bag that had clearly been packed and repacked many times over many years, and he asked her questions the whole way back, about Bram's history, his habits, what exactly he'd eaten and drunk, what the tonic contained, whether he'd ever had similar episodes before. She answered everything precisely, and he listened without interrupting, which told her he was the right kind of doctor. At Mrs. Pell's, Emery went upstairs and Marlo and Knox sat in the parlor and waited. It was past midnight. The boarding house was quiet around them. Mrs. Pell brought coffee without being asked, set it down, and went back to bed. Knox drank his coffee looking at the wall. "You all right?" Marlo said. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how tonight would have gone if you hadn't been there," he said, "or hadn't pushed when you did." He turned the cup in his hands. "I was going to wait for Voss to get back. That was my first thought. Wait for Voss." "That would have been a reasonable decision," she said. "It would have cost Bram about 5 hours," he said. She didn't answer that because there wasn't a useful answer. The hours would have been what they were. What mattered was the hours had gone differently. They sat for a while in the quiet. Then Knox said, "For what it's worth, and I know it probably isn't worth as much as it should be, I'll say what I didn't say when you first got to the ranch. You belong there, whatever Blackwell says." She looked at her coffee. "It's worth something," she said. Emery came downstairs 40 minutes later. He looked tired, but not alarmed, which was itself information. "He's stable," Emery said. "His heart has an irregular pattern that I want to monitor, but it's not critical right now. He needs rest, complete rest, no physical exertion, for at least 2 weeks, and then we reassess." He looked at Marlo. "That tonic you gave him, what was in it exactly?" She listed the components. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable cardiac support preparation," he said. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother," she said. "Your mother had good training," he said. There was nothing patronizing in it. It was just a professional acknowledgement from one person to another. "I want him to stay in Carver's Mill for 2 or 3 days before moving him. Mrs. Pell seems capable." "She is," Marlo said. "Can the ranch manage without him?" "We'll manage," she said. Emery nodded. He looked at her for a moment. "Miss Quinn," he said, "if you'd waited another day on this, I'm not sure what I'd be saying to you right now. The presentation you described, the progression over 2 weeks, that's the kind of thing that goes quietly wrong and then very suddenly catastrophically wrong." He paused. "You made the right calls." She absorbed that. "Thank you," she said. She and Knox drove back to Blackspur Ranch in the early morning dark, arriving just as the sky was starting to gray in the east. The yard was quiet. The cattle were just beginning to move in the pen, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Gideon was standing on the porch of the main house. He'd found the note, evidently, and done what Gideon Voss did with uncertainty, which was waited out in the cold rather than sleep through it indoors. She climbed down from the wagon, and her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours of sitting, and she stood for a moment getting herself steady. Gideon came down off the porch. "Bram?" he said. "Stable," she said. "Emery's with him at Mrs. Pell's. He'll be there 2 or 3 days, then he can come back. No heavy work for 2 weeks after that." Gideon let out a long breath. "You found Emery at Hargrove," he said. "Yes." "You drove 40 miles in the dark," he said. 46, roughly, she said. He stood there looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the closed-off assessment of those first days, not the careful non-expression he used at the table when she set food in front of him. Something more open than that. Something that had the quality of a man looking directly at something he'd been careful about, looking at directly. "You should have waited for me," he said. And it didn't come out the way she expected. It didn't come out as criticism. It came out sounding more like I should have been there. "There wasn't time," she said. "I know." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm not arguing with you. I'm saying I should have been there to make that call." "You couldn't have known," she said. "No," he said. He looked out at the gray-pink light coming up over the mountains. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her, which she supposed said something about her general expectations. "I'm tired," she said honestly, "and cold, but I'm all right." He nodded. "Go inside," he said. "I'll take care of the team." She started toward the house, then stopped. "Gideon?" He'd already turned toward the horses. He looked back. "When word gets around about tonight," she said, "Blackwell is going to use it somehow. I don't know how yet, but he will. I want you to be ready for that." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Let him," he said. She went inside. The kitchen was cold and she got the range going and put water on for coffee, and while she waited for it, she leaned against the kitchen wall and let herself be, just for a moment, exactly as tired as she was. The whole long night was in her body. The hours of cold, the riding, the waiting outside Emery's door, the drive back across the dark valley. She was not someone who looked for recognition. She hadn't ridden 46 miles in December darkness for the satisfaction of being thanked. But there was something in Emery's assessment, "You made the right calls," that she found herself returning to, not out of vanity, but out of something more fundamental. The plain confirmation, from someone qualified to give it, that she had seen clearly and acted correctly. She'd spent years in places where that kind of confirmation was withheld, not because she'd failed to earn it, but because the people who held it had decided she wasn't owed it. Years of closed doors and turned-over vacancy signs and sideways looks, and men like Sutter carrying messages on behalf of men like Blackwell. She hadn't been wrong about any of it, she thought. She'd never been wrong about what she could do. She'd just been in the wrong places. The coffee water started to boil. She pushed off the wall and got back to work. Word traveled fast in open country. It always had. Something about the landscape. How there was nothing to stop it. No walls or density to slow the passage of news from one property to the next. By the end of the week following Bram's crisis, the story had moved through Red Hollow Crossing and into the surrounding ranches and homesteads and all the way to Carver's Mill, carried by Knox and Emery and Mrs. Pell and Tobias Crick at the general store, who, for all his faults, had a genuine fondness for a dramatic story. What most people heard was a simple version. The cook at Blackspur Ranch had recognized a serious medical problem, acted without hesitation, and driven through the night to find a doctor. A man who'd been in trouble was going to be all right. What filtered through to Horace Blackwell was a more complicated version, and complicated information, in Blackwell's experience, was always leverage of some kind. She found out from Ada, on one of Ada's visits, that Blackwell had been asking about her credentials, not her work credentials. He'd already established that she had those. He was asking about her background, where she'd come from, whether she had formal medical training, whether a cook making medical decisions and administering preparations to a sick man constituted some kind of overreach. Marlowe listened to this and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, What's he going to do with that? Ada considered. Make it about something other than what it was, she said. That was about what Marlowe had expected. She went back to her kitchen and thought about it while she worked. The thinking and the working ran alongside each other in her mind without interfering. She'd gotten good at that over the years, letting the hands do what they knew while the mind worked on something else. Blackwell was going to try to reframe what had happened, not deny it. The outcome was too visible, Bram too alive and well-regarded for anyone to pretend the outcome was bad. He was going to try to make the action itself into something questionable, a woman without formal training making medical decisions, a cook overstepping her station, something along those lines. The county fair was in late January. She'd heard about it. Teddy had mentioned it, and Gideon had said something offhand about it being the social event in this part of the territory. There was a cooking competition. It was one of those facts she'd filed away without knowing yet what to do with it. She was starting to know what to do with it. She opened her mother's recipe chest. The wood of the lid was worn smooth under her hands from years of opening and closing it, from hands before hers and hands before those. Inside, the recipes were written on different kinds of paper, some on good stationery, some on brown paper, some on the backs of letters. They were in two handwritings, her grandmother's large looping script and her mother's smaller, more precise hand with Marlowe's own notes added over the years in the margins. She turned through the pages slowly, reading things she knew by heart, running her fingers along the edges of the paper. If Blackwell wanted a stage on which to expose her as inadequate, then a stage was what she'd give him. Bram came back to Blackspur Ranch on a Wednesday, 9 days after Knox had driven him to Carver's Mill. He came back in Dr. Emery's own rig, which Emery drove himself out of what he said was professional interest in the recovery, but which Marlowe suspected had more to do with the fact that Emery had heard about the ranch's kitchen and wanted to see it for himself. She fed them both lunch, Bram at the table, sitting carefully in the way of a man who'd been told to treat his body like borrowed equipment for a while, and Emery across from him, eating with the focused appreciation of a man who hadn't had a good meal in several days. Gideon sat at the end of the table and said very little, but he refilled his coffee twice, which meant he was comfortable, and comfortable was about as relaxed as Gideon got in company. That's a remarkable preparation, Emery said, looking at the stew she'd set in front of them. It's a standard braise, she said. No, it isn't, he said. What's the herb balance? She told him. He listened with the same quality of attention he'd given her descriptions of Bram's symptoms. Professionally interested, not performing interest, but actually having it. Your mother teach you that combination? The base, yes. I adjusted it over the years. He nodded slowly, eating. I've been practicing in this territory for 19 years, he said. I've had maybe 3 patients in all that time who could have identified what was wrong with Bram before it became critical. He looked at her directly. You should know that what you did mattered. Not just the driving, the recognizing. That's the harder part. Bram, across the table, said nothing. But he was looking at his bowl with an expression that suggested he was thinking about something he didn't plan to say out loud, which for Bram was the equivalent of a speech. After lunch, Emery found her alone in the kitchen. I heard about Blackwell, he said. He kept his voice low, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of the habit of a man who'd learned that some conversations needed a smaller room. She kept working, wiping down the table. Word travels. He came to see me last week, Emery said. Asked whether I thought it was appropriate for an untrained person to be administering preparations to a sick man without a doctor's supervision. She stopped wiping and looked at him. What did you tell him? She said. I told him the preparations were appropriate, the decisions were correct, and that if she hadn't acted when she did, I'd likely have been writing a different kind of report. He said it simply, without apparent satisfaction, just as a statement of what had happened. He didn't like that. No, she said. I'd imagine he didn't. He's going to make something of the fair, Emery said. I don't know exactly what, but I know how he operates. He'll set something up that looks like a fair contest and isn't. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Are you going to enter? Yes, she said. He studied her face. You're not worried. I'm worried, she said. I just think worried and ready aren't mutually exclusive. He picked up his hat from the peg by the kitchen door. For what it's worth, he said, I'll be there. The county fair ran over 2 days in the last week of January, on the flat ground south of Red Hollow Crossing, where someone had years ago built a series of long, open-sided structures that served as display halls and competition spaces. It drew people from across the territory, not just the ranching families, but homesteaders, small merchants, people who came 40 miles for the specific pleasure of being among a crowd for a day. Marlo had been thinking about the competition since she'd opened her mother's recipe chest that night after Bram's crisis. She'd been thinking about it in the way she thought about all practical problems, systematically, without rushing the conclusions, letting the thinking settle until it was ready. The cooking competition had 3 categories: preserved goods, baked goods, and a prepared dish. The judging was done by a panel of 5, traditionally prominent members of the community appointed by the fair committee. She knew without asking that Blackwell had influence over that committee. She knew without asking that the panel would not be selected in her favor. So she didn't think about the panel. She thought about the food. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Blackwell could arrange the judges, but he couldn't arrange the food. Whatever she put on that table was going to be tasted by hundreds of people, not just 5 judges, tasted and discussed and carried home in memory. The judges could give the ribbon to whoever they chose. They couldn't control what people thought when they ate her food. She spent 3 weeks preparing. She made small test batches at the ranch, with the crew as her tasting committee. This was, it turned out, one of the better decisions she made, not because the men were sophisticated tasters, but because they were honest ones. Teddy would eat anything you put in front of him and tell you it was good. His opinion was useless. But Fourier, the Canadian, had a palate that was better than he knew, and when something was wrong, he couldn't hide it. His face would do something small and complicated, a slight tightening around the eyes, and she'd learned to watch for it. The Ruiz brothers, Miguel and Ernesto, had grown up with food that had genuine depth of flavor, built from generations of knowledge, and they were the hardest to satisfy at the table, which made their satisfaction worth something. She adjusted her preparations based on all of it. For the preserved goods category, she entered 2 jars of a spiced fruit preserve her mother had developed, something that sat between sweet and savory, that worked on bread and also alongside meat, that had a complexity most preserves didn't try for. For baked goods, she made a honey and cornmeal bread that had been in her family so long she didn't know where it started. She added a variation she'd developed herself over 2 seasons in Laramie, a small adjustment to the fat ratio that made the crumb tighter and the crust crackle in a particular way when you broke it. For the prepared dish, she chose the braised short rib with serviceberry that she'd been making at the ranch since December, the one Gideon had eaten 2 servings of without comment, which remained, by her private accounting, one of the strongest endorsements she'd received. The morning of the first fair day, Gideon came to the kitchen while she was packing the last of her entries into the transport crates and said, "I'm taking you in the ranch wagon. The whole crew's coming." She looked at him. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I'm not doing it because I need to," he said. "I'm doing it because Blackwell's going to have people there, and I'm not sending you in alone." She held his gaze for a moment. "I can handle Blackwell." "I know you can," he said. "I still want to be there." She turned back to her packing. Something had shifted between them in the weeks since Bram's crisis. Nothing dramatic, nothing said outright. Just a gradual reduction in the careful distance they'd both been maintaining, as if the temperature had dropped enough that standing closer made practical sense. She was aware of it without knowing what to do with it, which was itself a new experience. She was generally a person who knew what to do with most things. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and went to get the wagon. Red Hollow. Crossing looked different with people in it. The main street was crowded, the flat south of town even more so, and the fairgrounds had a noise to them that carried back into the town itself. Voices, the sounds of animals being shown, music from somewhere near the eastern hall. There were wagons and horses tied along every available rail and post, and people moved between the display structures in the slow-looking way of people who had nowhere particular to be for a few hours and were enjoying it. Marlo carried her crates to the competition hall with Teddy and Miguel helping, and she registered her entries with the woman at the table near the entrance, a sharp-faced woman who looked at the entry sheet and then at Marlo, and then back at the sheet in the way of someone doing a quick calculation. "Black Spur Ranch," the woman said. "That's right," Marlo said. The woman stamped the form and handed it back without further comment. Marlo found her designated table, set up her entries, and stepped back to look at them. The competition tables ran the length of the hall. There were maybe 30 entries in total across the categories, from homesteads and ranch kitchens and town households throughout the county. Most of them were solid, competent work, the kind of cooking that kept families fed through hard winters. A few were genuinely impressive. Marlowe's entries sat at the far end of the table and looked exactly like what they were. Good food, well made, without decoration or performance. She heard Blackwell before she saw him. He had the kind of voice that traveled, not loud exactly, but projected, the voice of a man who'd learned early that being heard was a form of authority. He was talking to two other men near the hall entrance, and she caught fragments of it, words like standards and tradition and this county's character, that told her what he was setting up. She didn't look at him. She arranged her jars a fraction of an inch to the left and turned and went to find the crew. Sub. Bram was sitting on a bench outside the hall with Emery, who had materialized from somewhere looking characteristically tired and characteristically alert. Bram was still moving carefully, but his color was better and his eyes were sharp, and when he saw Marlowe coming, he straightened up slightly. "Entries are in?" he said. "Entries are in," she said. "What'd you make?" She told him. He nodded slowly at each item with the expression of a man who had strong feelings about food, but had gotten out of the habit of showing them. "Your mother's preserve?" he said. "The same recipe, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a woman make me something like that once," he said. "Long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. Emery said, "Blackwell's been working the judges since yesterday." "I know," Marlowe said. "He put Dunmore on the panel," Emery said. "And a man named Carver. He owns the mill east of town. He's been in Blackwell's pocket for years." "That's 2 of 5. She said. 3, Emery said. "The woman they put in charge of the baked goods category is Dunmore's sister-in-law." Marlowe sat down on the bench beside Bram and thought about this for a moment. "Who are the other 2? She said. "Widow named Forsyth. She's fair. She just won't fight for anything. And Dr. Raines from the territorial office. He came up for the fair. Blackwell didn't expect him." Emery's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Raines is not the kind of man Blackwell can manage." 2 out of 5 who'll judge honestly," Marlowe said. "Maybe 3, if Mrs. Forsyth tastes something she can't argue with," Emery said. She thought about that. "Then I need to make something she can't argue with," she said. The judging began at 2 in the afternoon, and a crowd gathered around the competition tables in the way crowds gathered around anything that had the quality of a contest. That specific human appetite for watching someone win or lose something in public. Marlowe stood back near the wall with Gideon beside her, and the rest of the crew ranged loosely around them, and she watched the 5 judges move along the table. She watched the way Dunmore tasted, quickly, dismissively, making notes without lingering. She watched Blackwell's man Carver do the same. She watched Dr. Raines taste methodically, going back for second samples of 3 or 4 entries including hers, which she noted. She watched Mrs. Forsyth. The widow Forsyth was a woman in her late 60s with white hair pinned back severely and hands that had done serious work for a long time. She tasted things the way Marlowe's mother had tasted things, deliberately, with her eyes closed briefly, the way you closed your eyes when you were trying to hear something more clearly. When she tasted the spiced fruit preserve, she went back for a second spoonful. When she tasted the cornmeal honey bread, she stood at the table for a long moment before moving on. When she got to the short rib preparation, she set down her fork and picked it up again, and her expression went through something private. Teddy, behind Marlowe, said very quietly, "She likes it." "Don't say that," Marlowe said just as quietly. "I'm just saying what I see." "Stop seeing things out loud," she said. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Marlowe spent those 40 minutes standing very still and thinking about the kitchen at Blackspur Ranch, about the early morning fires and the cold, and the 9 men who came hungry and went away fed, and the long accumulation of days that had brought her here. She thought about her mother's recipe chest and the worn wood of the lid under her palms, and all the mornings she'd opened it and found something in it she needed. She was not a woman who prayed, but she was a woman who believed in the work, and she'd done the work. And that was all she had. Gideon was standing close enough that she was aware of his presence, not touching, but close. At some point during the deliberation, his arm had come to rest against hers. A slight contact, barely anything, and neither of them moved away from it. The panel chair, a rancher named Aldous, whom she'd never met, came to the front of the hall and called for quiet. He read the results. Preserved goods. Marlowe Quinn, Blackspur Ranch. First place. Someone in the crowd made a sound. Not quite applause, more like a collective intake of breath being released. Baked goods. A woman named Hetty Marsh from the Dunmore district. Second place. Marlowe Quinn, Blackspur Ranch. First place. The sound in the crowd changed. She heard Dunmore say something near the judge's table, a low, sharp word, and she heard Raines respond to it in a tone that did not invite further comment. Prepared dish. Marlowe Quinn, Blackspur Ranch. First place. The hall went loud. Not politely loud, genuinely loud, the sound of a crowd that hadn't expected something and found it could still be surprised. People near her entries leaned in for second looks. She heard fragments of conversation. Who is she? And Black Spur, and tried some of the bread. It was remarkable. And underneath all of it, the particular energy of a story forming in real time, which was the thing about public moments like this, the way they wrote themselves into a community's memory as they happened. Blackwell was standing near the far wall, and she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Mrs. Forsyth found her in the crowd a few minutes later. She was smaller up close than she'd looked at the judging table, and she looked at Marlowe with clear, considering eyes. "The preserve," she said. "What's the spice balance?" Marlowe told her. Forsyth nodded slowly. "My mother made something with a similar base," she said. "I haven't tasted that combination in 40 years. She paused. "Where did you learn it?" "My mother," Marlowe said. The widow looked at her for a moment with something in her face that was beyond the competition, beyond the fairground, beyond whatever Blackwell had been trying to arrange. It was the look of one woman recognizing in another a particular kind of inheritance, the knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, through kitchens and hard years. "She taught you well," Forsyth said. "She did," Marlowe said. Forsyth nodded once and moved away into the crowd. Blackwell moved against her before the day was out. He did it through this fair committee, filing a formal objection to the judging on grounds that the panel's deliberation had been improperly influenced, a vague charge, unprovable in either direction, designed not to overturn the results, but to cast a shadow over them. He also told 3 people, in the confident tone of a man sharing established fact, that Marlowe Quinn had no formal training, no fixed residence, and no verifiable credentials, and that the competition should be understood accordingly. She heard about all of it within 2 hours because Knox heard it from Fourier, who heard it from one of the Ruiz brothers, who had been standing near enough to Blackwell's conversations to catch them. She was at the edge of the fairground with Gideon when Knox brought the report. Gideon's face went the way it went when something made him angry. Very still, very controlled, the kind of stillness that had energy in it. "He filed a committee objection," he said, not a question. "That's what Knox heard," she said. Gideon looked out at the fairground for a moment. "The committee meeting is tomorrow morning before the second day opens," he said. "Blackwell's going to push for a review." "He won't get the results overturned," she said. "Raines won't allow it, and he knows it. What he wants is the conversation, the public question." "So we take the public question away from him," Gideon said. "How?" He turned to look at her. "There's a town meeting tonight. It was already scheduled, quarterly meeting at the hall. Half the county will be there." He paused. "I'm going to speak." "Gideon? I've been quiet about this long enough," he said. "That was the wrong call, and I knew it was the wrong call when I was making it. I kept thinking it would resolve on its own. It doesn't resolve on its own. Men like Blackwell only stop when someone makes stopping cost more than continuing." She looked at him carefully. "This is going to make him your enemy directly." "He's already my enemy," Gideon said. "He's just been polite about it." She didn't argue further. She understood, in a way she hadn't entirely expected to, that this was not something she could or should stop. Gideon had his own accounting to do with himself about the weeks he'd let pass while Blackwell ran his campaign, and this was how he was doing it. She recognized that kind of reckoning because she'd done her own versions of it over the years. The town hall that evening was fuller than its quarterly meeting usually warranted, which suggested that word had traveled from the fairground and people were expecting something. The hall had rough wooden benches arranged in rows facing a small raised platform, and by the time Marlowe arrived with Gideon and Bram and the rest of the crew, it was near full, maybe 120 people pressing into a space built for 80. Blackwell was already there, near the front, flanked by Dunmore and two other men whose names she didn't know. He saw Marlowe come in, and his expression did something controlled and precise. Not anger, not contempt, but the look of a man filing information, adjusting his plan. The meeting opened with the usual business: road maintenance, a dispute over a water right on the North Fork, news of a territorial legislation change affecting land registration. Marlowe sat in the third row and listened and waited. When the floor opened for general matters, Gideon stood up. The room noticed. He wasn't someone who stood up at town meetings, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he generally preferred to act on them privately. People who knew him, which was most of the room, registered his standing with a particular quality of attention. He said, clearly and without preamble, "I want to speak about Horace Blackwell's campaign against my cook." The room went quiet. He laid it out plainly, not dramatically, not with the performer's instinct for building tension, but with the rancher's habit of describing a situation exactly as it was. He described Sutter's visit. He described the Cattlemen's Association comments. He described the committee objection filed that afternoon. He described the things Blackwell had said about Marlowe's background and credentials. "The woman he's been trying to drive out of this county," Gideon said, "is the same woman who recognized a serious medical crisis in one of my hands, administered appropriate treatment, and drove 46 miles through the night in December to find Dr. Emery before Bram Mercer died in a boarding house bed." He paused. "Some of you know Bram. He's been in this county for 30 years. He's sitting in this room right now." Bram, beside Marlowe, did not look up, but she heard him exhale slowly. "She won 3 categories at today's competition," Gideon continued. "And before the ribbon was dry, Blackwell had a committee objection filed and was telling people her credentials couldn't be verified. Her credentials are the work she's done. It's verifiable by anyone who wants to verify it." He sat down. There was a long moment where the room seemed to be deciding something collectively. Then Dr. Emery stood up from near the back wall. He said, in the dry, precise way of a man who'd given a great deal of testimony in his life and knew how to make it land, "I can verify the medical assessment. The preparations Marlowe Quinn administered to Bram Mercer were appropriate, correctly dosed, and contributed to his stability until I could reach him. If she hadn't acted when she did, I would, in reasonable medical probability, be attending a different kind of event this week." He sat down. Blackwell stood up. He was a composed man, Blackwell, and his composure was one of his genuine assets. He didn't visibly rattle, and he'd been in rooms like this one before and knew how to work them. He spoke about community standards and the importance of established credentials and the difficulty of verifying the backgrounds of people who came through the territory without fixed roots. He was good at it. She gave him that. But the room wasn't with him. She could feel it. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of settled resistance, the resistance of people who'd heard a clear story and were not inclined to have it complicated by someone with an interest in complicating it. When he finished, Mrs. Forsythe stood up. The room turned to look at her. She was a woman who didn't speak often at these meetings, and her standing up had a weight to it. "I was on the judging panel today," she said. "I tasted everything on that table. Marlowe Quinn's entries were the best in every category, not by a small margin, by a considerable margin." She looked at Blackwell briefly. "I've been in this county for 40 years, and I know what good work looks like, and I know what attempts to discredit good work look like. This is the second kind." She sat back down. Blackwell started to say something. The room was already moving on. The meeting chair called for other matters, and people began to talk among themselves. And Blackwell found himself standing at the front of a room that had collectively and quietly decided to be finished with his particular argument. There was no dramatic moment, no single decisive response. It was something quieter and more complete than that, the simple collective withdrawal of attention from a man who had been relying on it. He sat down. Marlowe, in the third row, looked at her hands in her lap. Gideon, beside her, said nothing, but he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold hall, and she didn't move away, and neither did he. Outside, the January dark had settled over Red Hollow Crossing, and the temperature was somewhere well below freezing, and the stars were out again over the mountains. The same stars she'd driven under that December night, going north to find Emery, the the same indifferent, magnificent sky that had watched all of this from a great distance. She thought about her mother and about closed doors and about the long, specific work of proving something true. She thought, it's not over yet. But something has turned. She was right about both things. The morning after the town meeting, Blackwell's committee objection was reviewed and dismissed. It took the fair committee 12 minutes. Dr. Raines chaired the session, and Marlowe wasn't present for it. She was back at the fairground for the second day, setting up the preserved goods display that would remain on public view through the afternoon. But Knox was there, standing near the back of the committee room, out of what he called general interest, and what was actually a deliberate choice to have eyes in the room, and he reported back to her by noon. Raines read the objection, asked if anyone had evidence of actual procedural irregularity, waited about 10 seconds, and dismissed it, Knox said. He was eating one of her biscuits while he talked, which she'd started to recognize as his version of high spirits. Dunmore tried to say something about credential verification. Raines said credential verification wasn't a competition requirement and never had been, and if Dunmore wanted to propose a rule change, he could bring it to next year's committee. And Blackwell, she said. Wasn't in the room, Knox said. Sent Dunmore to carry it. She thought about that for a moment. Blackwell sending Dunmore instead of coming himself meant one of two things. Either he'd already decided the objection was going to fail and didn't want to be present for it, or he was saving himself for something else. She didn't think he was done. Men like Blackwell didn't simply stop because one strategy had failed. They regrouped, reassessed, looked for different angles. But something had shifted in the landscape of the county's opinion, and they both knew it, and that shift changed what options remained to him. She went back to her display table and talked to the people who stopped to look at her entries, and there were more of them than she expected. Not just fair visitors being politely curious, but people who'd been at the town meeting the night before, or who'd heard about it, and who came to her table with that particular energy of people who want to register something without quite knowing how to say it directly. An older woman whose name she didn't know tasted the preserve and stood there for a moment and said, I want the recipe. I'll write it out for you, Marlowe said. I didn't think you would, the woman said. Something in her tone acknowledged, obliquely, that she'd had reasons not to expect generosity, and that she recognized those reasons reflected poorly on herself rather than on Marlowe. Marlowe wrote out the recipe on a page from her small notebook and handed it over. The woman folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and went on her way without saying much else. But the exchange had the quality of something that mattered, even in its smallness. Maybe especially in its smallness. That was the thing about repair. It rarely happened in grand gestures. It happened in the small moments when someone decided to do differently than they had before. And the decision was quiet and specific and real. February came in with cold that had a different character than January's, drier, sharper, the kind that made the air feel breakable. The ranch settled into the deep winter rhythm that Marlowe had come to know well by now. The days short and demanding, the evenings long and quiet. The work never finished, but at least predictable in its shape. Bram was back on modified duty, which for Bram meant doing roughly 60% of what he normally did and complaining steadily about the other 40. Emery had come out twice to check on him, and the second visit he'd told Bram that his heart had stabilized in a way that was genuinely encouraging, that whatever combination of rest and treatment and... He'd looked at Marlowe when he said this. The preparation she'd administered in the early days had given the damaged tissue time to compensate. You might get another 10 years out of that engine if you're not stupid about it, Emery had said to Bram, in the direct way Emery said most things. Bram had said, I haven't been stupid about it for 63 years. You hid symptoms for 2 weeks, Emery said. Bram had no particular answer for that. Marlowe, setting coffee in front of both of them, said nothing. But she noted it. The way Bram sat with that small deflation that came from being caught in something true. He was a man who didn't offer much, Bram, but what he offered was reliable, and she'd come to value reliable over effusive a long time ago. The question of Blackwell resolved itself, ultimately, not through confrontation, but through the slow withdrawal of credibility that happens when a man has been publicly wrong and can't recover the ground. His influence at the Cattlemen's Association had always rested on a particular image, the man who understood how things worked, who knew the county's character, who could read people and situations accurately. That image had taken damage at the town meeting, Not because anyone had attacked it directly, but because the room had simply contradicted it, quietly and collectively, by paying attention to the evidence in front of them. In March, the spring cattle sale came around. 3 ranchers who'd been in Blackwell's circle came to Gideon's sale table and bought stock without the usual complications or delays. One of them, a man named Aldous Pierce, who'd been avoiding Gideon since December, shook Gideon's hand and said, with the bluntness of a man clearing old debt, "I should have said something sooner about the situation with your cook." Gideon said, "It's settled now." "Still," Pierce said. Gideon didn't belabor it. He was not a man who needed the last word, and he understood that Pierce's showing up at all was the thing that mattered, not the exact words around it. Marlowe heard about this from Gideon that evening, told in the flat, factual way he told most things, and she sat with it for a moment before responding. "He came to the sale," she said. "He came to the sale," Gideon confirmed. "That's something," she said. "It is," he said. It wasn't, she thought, justice, not in any clean or complete sense. Blackwell still ran his bank. He still had money and history and the particular durability of men who'd built their position over decades. He would still have influence, just less of it, and in different places. The county's opinion of him had shifted, but opinion was a slow-moving thing and didn't transform overnight into consequence. But the damage to his capacity to harm her specifically was real. His campaign had been built on the premise that the community would follow his lead on the question of who belonged where. The community, given the chance to actually taste her food and hear her story and watch her act under pressure, had not followed his lead. And once a campaign loses its premise, it tends to collapse inward rather than forward. She was not a woman who needed her enemies' ruin to feel safe. She needed them removed from her path, which was different. The path was now clearer than it had been in November, and she intended to walk it. The conversation with Gideon happened on a Sunday evening in late March, when the light was starting to come back into the days and the first hesitant signs of the land waking up were visible in the south pasture. Small things, green pushing through where the snow had pulled back, a quality in the air that was different from winter, even when it was still cold. She was cleaning the kitchen after supper. The crew long dispersed to the bunkhouse, and Gideon came in and sat at the kitchen table in the way he sometimes did, the way she'd come to recognize as him wanting company, but not quite wanting to say so. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the range and watched her work. After a while, he said, "Spring sale went well." "I heard," she said. "Good enough that I'm thinking about expanding the south herd," he said. "Need to hire on 2 more hands for summer. Possibly renegotiate the supply contracts." "The Crick contract should be renegotiated anyway," she said. "He's been good since I adjusted it, but there's still room." "I was thinking," Gideon said, and then stopped. She glanced over at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. "You were thinking," she said, prompting him, because she'd learned that Gideon needed occasional prompting, or he'd just sit with whatever he was thinking indefinitely. "I was thinking about what you said when you first got here," he said, "that you were looking for a place that suited you." She stopped what she was doing. "I said something like that," she said. "Do you still feel that way?" he said. "Like you're still looking?" She turned and leaned against the work table and looked at him directly. "What are you asking, Gideon?" He looked up from his coffee. His face was doing that thing it did when he was working through something that mattered to him. The careful stillness, the slight tension around the eyes. "I'm asking if Black Spur feels like the place you were looking for," he said, "or if it's still just a position." She thought about how to answer that honestly, because he deserved honesty, and because she owed it to herself not to answer carelessly. "When I rode out here in November," she said slowly, "I had $42 and nowhere to sleep, and 6 doors had been closed in my face in one afternoon. This was the end of the road. I came here because I had nothing else." He nodded. He didn't look away. "And now?" he said. "Now," she said. "I wake up in the morning and I know what the day is going to need from me. And I know I can give it, and that knowledge it's mine, in a way that hasn't always been true." She paused. "The kitchen is mine. The crew trusts me. The work matters." She looked at him. "And the man who runs the ranch is someone I respect, which I can't say has always been true of the men I've worked for." Something moved in his face at that. "That's not quite what I was asking," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. I'm getting there. He waited. Yes, she said. This is the place I was looking for. I didn't know what it would look like when I found it, but this is it. She took a breath. I'm not going anywhere. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Gideon said, I want to make the position formal. Not just cook, ranch manager, kitchen and provisions, but also supply contracts, budget oversight, crew welfare. You've been doing most of it already, he paused, with appropriate compensation. She looked at him. Is that a business arrangement you're proposing? She said. Partly, he said. The word partly sat between them. She said, What's the other part? He stood up from the table and set his coffee cup down and crossed the kitchen in the way of a man who'd made a decision he'd been putting off for too long and was done putting it off. He was close enough that she could see the weathered lines of his face clearly, the gray that had started at his temples, the way his hands were hanging at his sides with a deliberate stillness that was its own form of restraint. I'd like to know, he said carefully, if there's something between us besides respect and working proximity. She looked at him for a long moment. There were, she thought, two kinds of people who asked questions like that. The first kind asked them because they wanted a particular answer and couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. The second kind asked them because they genuinely needed to know, because they'd been carrying the question honestly, and it had become too heavy to carry in silence. Gideon was the second kind. She was sure of that. I think there has been for a while, she said. I've been cautious about it. Because of the working situation, he said. That's part of it, she said. And because I've been in places before where I thought something was solid and it wasn't. I've learned not to move fast. That's sensible, he said. It is, she said. I'm still being sensible. But, he said. She looked at him. But I'm not moving away from it anymore either, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just picked it up from where it was resting on the work table and held it in both of his, and looked at it for a moment, and then at her. All right, he said. All right, she said. Spring came fully in April, and with it the particular ordered chaos of a ranch coming back to life after winter. The calving, the fence work, the hiring of the two new hands Gideon had talked about, the renegotiation of the crick contract that Marlowe handled herself, and which came out considerably better than the previous arrangement. The two new hands were young, one barely 20, one 22. And they came in raw and wary the way young men always did. And within 2 weeks of Marlowe's kitchen, they were eating better than they ever had, and starting to relax into the work the way well-fed people relax, with their full attention available rather than divided. Teddy, who had been at the ranch the longest of the younger crew, appointed himself something of an unofficial orientation guide for the new men, which included a tour of the kitchen and its customs and a set of what he called rules. Rule 1, he told them, don't come to the table dirty. Rule 2, he said, don't complain about what's on the table because it's better than anything you've ever had, and it's better than you deserve. Marlowe, who was in the kitchen and could hear all of this through the walkway door, said nothing. But she was smiling at the work table, and Bram, who was sitting nearby shelling dried beans, caught her at it and said nothing either, just looked at her with that particular quiet in his face that she'd learned meant he was content. Bram was different in spring. He'd always been a still man, a private man, someone who kept his interior life well away from public view. But the winter had changed him in some way she couldn't entirely name. Not softened him, that wasn't the right word, but opened something that had been shut for a long time. He talked more than he used to. Not much more, but measurably. He told stories sometimes at the supper table, about the early days of the ranch, about Gideon's father, about the territory before the railroad came through and changed its character. One evening in April, he told a story about a woman he'd known 30 years ago, a cook at a ranch in the Bighorn country, who'd made a preserve from choke cherries and something else he couldn't remember that had tasted like the best thing he'd ever put in his mouth. He'd been 23, working his first real outfit, homesick in the way young men are when they're too proud to say so. She never told me what was in it, he said. I asked 3 times. She said a recipe was a private thing and I hadn't earned it. She was right, Marlowe said. I know she was right, Bram said. I'm just saying I still think about that preserve. What happened to her? Ernesto Ruiz said. Bram shrugged. I moved on. Most people move on in this kind of work. He was quiet for a moment. I think about that sometimes. How much you lose just by moving. The table was quiet. Then Marlowe said, "You didn't move this time." Bram looked at her. "No," he said. "I didn't." In May, something happened that Marlowe hadn't expected and probably should have. Horace Blackwell came to Blackspur Ranch. He came alone, which surprised her, and in the middle of a weekday morning, which surprised her more. She saw him from the kitchen window, riding in on a bay horse, sitting straight the way he always did. She watched him tie the horse at the yard rail and come toward the main house. Gideon wasn't there. He was in the north pasture with two of the crew. She was alone in the kitchen. She went to the front door and opened it before he knocked. They looked at each other. Blackwell looked, she thought, older than he had at the county fair. Not dramatically. Just the way men who'd spent energy on something and lost it looked when the spending caught up with them. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "May I come in?" he said. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing consideration, but actually thinking about what this visit meant and what she was willing to give it. "You can come in for coffee," she said. "I'm working, so it'll have to be brief." He came into the kitchen and sat at the table, and she poured coffee and sat across from him and waited. He turned his cup in his hands. "I've been thinking," he said, "about whether to come here for 2 months." "What decided it?" she said. "Practicality," he said. He said it in the tone of a man who'd been working up to something and needed to say it plainly before he lost the nerve for it. "I made judgments about you that were based on, not on you specifically, on assumptions I had that turned out to be wrong." He paused. "That's all I came to say." She looked at him. He wasn't warm. He wasn't apologetic in the full sense of the word. He wasn't a man built for contrition, and he wasn't trying to perform it. What he was doing was something more minimal and more honest than that. He was acknowledging a fact he could no longer pretend wasn't a fact. "I appreciate that," she said. "I doubt it," he said. "You're right that I'm not going to thank you for it," she said, "but I appreciate the honesty of coming in person." She met his eyes. "You put real effort into making my life here difficult. That caused real harm, not just to me. You know that." He said nothing, but he didn't look away, which she counted for something. "The question," she said, "is what you do going forward. Coming here is one thing. What matters after this is different." He nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man who'd received information he intended to sit with. He drank his coffee. He left. She stood at the window and watched him ride back down the drive and out onto the South Road, and she thought about what had just happened, and what it meant, and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean forgiveness in any simple sense. It didn't mean the harm was undone, or the doors that had been slammed in her face had somehow stopped mattering. It didn't mean Blackwell was a changed man in any fundamental way. People who'd built their sense of order on certain beliefs didn't dismantle those beliefs because of one failed campaign. He'd be more careful going forward. He'd pick battles differently. Whether that translated into anything genuine over time, she didn't know. What she did know was that she was still standing in the kitchen of Blackspur Ranch, and the fire in the range was burning clean, and Bram was coming up the covered walkway for his morning coffee, and outside the spring grass was coming up green in the south pasture, and the life she was living was hers in a way it had never quite been before. That was what she knew. The recipe chest sat on the shelf above the work table now, the shelf she'd cleared and rebuilt with a piece of good pine Gideon had found in the barn lumber pile. She'd asked him to help her mount the brackets level, which had led to a 20-minute disagreement about what level actually meant that had ended with both of them laughing. Not politely, but genuinely, the real kind that came from somewhere you weren't managing. She opened the chest most mornings. Not always to take something out, sometimes just to open it. To smell the cardamom and the smoke and the particular dry wood smell of the box itself. To look at the pages in her mother's handwriting and her grandmother's handwriting and her own handwriting in the margins. There were things in that chest that had fed people for decades. There were recipes that had come from women who'd cooked in hard circumstances and worked out, over years of trial and adjustment and paying close attention, how to make something good from what was available. That knowledge had been passed forward, hand to hand, generation to generation, not because anyone had decided to preserve it formally, but because it mattered, and someone always understood that it mattered, and made sure it continued. She thought about that sometimes, about what you carry, and what it means to carry it. About the things you bring with you through closed doors and frozen prairies and rooms full of people who've already decided what you are before you've opened your mouth. You carry them because they're part of what you know, which is part of what you are, which is the only real credential anyone ever has. The chest had come to her worn at the corners and smelling of a lifetime of use. She intended to hand it on someday in the same condition, more worn, smelling of more use, with more pages and more handwriting, the record of more kitchens and more people who'd been fed. That was a long way off. She had years of cooking ahead of her at Black Spur, years of the particular daily work of feeding people well, which she'd known all her life was harder than it looked, and more important than most people said. So, on the first warm evening in June, when the sun stayed up late enough to make the yard golden and the crew sat outside after supper for the first time since fall, Gideon came and stood beside her on the porch of the covered walkway, and they looked out at the south pasture together. The cattle were out in the long grass. The two new hands were somewhere near the barn, talking. Bram was sitting on an upturned crate near the fence, tilted toward the last light the way old men tilt toward warmth, eyes half closed, looking like something carved out of the country itself. Gideon said, "You know what I thought that first morning, when I came into the kitchen and you'd already started the fire and had eggs going?" "What?" she said. "I thought, either she's going to be more trouble than she's worth, or she's going to change everything." He paused. "I wasn't wrong on either count." She looked at him sideways. "You think I was trouble?" "You renegotiated my supply contract without telling me first," he said. "I got you a better price." "I know," he said. "That was the trouble part." She laughed. He was smiling. Not the small, controlled thing he usually allowed himself, but something wider, something that reached his eyes, which she'd learned to watch for because it was the version of him he kept closest to himself. She thought about the woman who'd come into Red Hollow Crossing that November afternoon with $42 and a recipe chest and nowhere to sleep. And she thought about all the nights between then and now, the cold rides, and the dark kitchens, and the long work of earning something in a place that hadn't wanted to give it. She thought about what she'd been looking for. She'd told herself she was looking for a place that suited her. That had been true as far as it went. But what she'd really been looking for, though she hadn't known how to name it, was something more specific than a place. It was the experience of being known for what she actually was, rather than for what people had decided she was before she'd had a chance to demonstrate anything. It was the particular relief of being in a room where you could do your work without fighting for the right to do it. It was being seen clearly by people who'd had the opportunity to look. That was what she'd found at Black Spur. Not on the first day, not without cost, not without the long, patient work of proving it through 10,000 small demonstrations, but found, finally, irreversibly. Bram said something from his crate near the fence. She couldn't quite hear what, just the low rumble of his voice. And one of the new hands laughed, and the evening settled around all of them, warm and specific and real. She had not been wrong about herself. That was the thing she wanted to hold on to. Through all of it, the closed doors, the cold road, Blackwell's campaign, the long, uncertain winter. She had not been wrong about what she was capable of or what she deserved. The world had been wrong about her, and she had stayed true to what she knew until the world had run out of arguments. That was not a small thing. It had cost a great deal. But it was hers, entirely and permanently, and no one could take it back. Gideon reached over and took her hand, the same way he had that evening in March, without ceremony, just picked it up and held it. The light went slowly out of the western sky, and the mountains cut their familiar line against the darkening blue, and the fire in the kitchen range was burning low and steady behind them. And at Black Spur Ranch on a June evening, everything that needed to be settled had been settled. Not perfectly. Nothing ever was. There would be hard winters and difficult sails and moments of doubt and the ordinary friction of people living and working closely together. There would be days when the work was too much and days when the loneliness came back regardless of what surrounded it, because loneliness was like that. It didn't always care about circumstances, but the door was open. Not the door of a boarding house or a business that hadn't wanted her, not the door held open by pity or grudging tolerance, but the door of a life that had been built around her real self, her actual knowledge and skill and character, by people who had seen those things clearly and chosen to stand beside them. That door was open, and it was going to stay open, and Marlo Quinn walked through it every morning when she lit the kitchen fire, and every evening when she closed the chest and set it back on its shelf, and every ordinary day in between, which was where most of a life happened anyway. In the between days. In the work. In the quiet company of people who finally knew her name.